so that it'll happen when we go live. I'll play a intro video, which you should be able to hear,
Okay.
but you won't be able to talk.
All right.
Okay. All right. Hello, folks, and welcome to On the Other Hand with Kevin Beegle. This show is available live on the We Are Paradox Network every Wednesday and Thursday starting at 7 p.m. Pacific. The opinions expressed on this show are those of the host and its guests, and they do not necessarily reflect those of the other hosts, the management, the network, or any affiliated stations.
I don't know what that means.
It means that if you have a problem with this show, you should probably just contact me rather than bothering anybody else. This is a live show, so it's not scripted,
There's no words there.
and we don't write anything down.
Yeah, I can't read it. There's no words on it. I can't do it.
I understand.
Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Well, let's do this. We should probably just not worry about what anybody thinks.
What does that mean?
Let's just go ahead and get started.
All right, go. We'll do it live.
Okay.
We'll do it live.
And now for the meat and potatoes. And I am joined by my guest, Russell Brinegar, deep in the heart of Hoosier country. Hi, Russ.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing well. You know, that every time I do this show, that intro gets more and more pertinent because it seems like when you're trying to do a show in video and you're trying to do a show on audio and everything like that, it just gets crazy. So I appreciate the fact that we were a little bit late today. Russell, it wasn't Russell's fault. It was just the old computer giving me some trouble today. And I am so excited to talk to Russell about his book, which is called Overlords of the Singularity. And it's available on Amazon as a paperback and a Kindle book. I downloaded the Kindle book. Russell, I'm glad you made a Kindle version because I have a blindness in one eye and I don't see very well and I have to blow everything up. So it was great. And then I don't know if you know this, but if you have the Alexa app, it'll actually read it to you too.
Well, yeah, the first thing I did when I published it on Kindle was download it into my Kindle and let the machine voice read my own book to me, and that was quite the experience. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I actually caught a couple of spelling errors that I wouldn't have. It's 545 pages in print, and your eyes go cross-eyed proofreading it. And hearing the voice, I caught some stuff audibly that I didn't catch visually, so I went back and corrected it. So that worked out great.
Yeah, it's an amazing work, and it's kind of one of those things where I think that I became friends with you because you posted a lot on Connie Willis's site or page, and I became your friend, and I thought, man, this guy's really smart, and he's got a lot going on, but it's interesting that you've made this transition from a person who had a very, very sort of fundamentalist background to where you're at now. Do you want to talk about how that's transmuted you, or you've changed over the years a little bit, sort of give people a background of how you came to your understanding of the universe?
Well, sure. My childhood was on the Space Coast down in Titusville, Florida, and I grew up wanting to be an astronaut when I was a child, like we all did. And it was a fundamentalist Christian upbringing, Baptist. I used to go to Bible school at Westside Baptist down in Titusville. And when I was around the age of 13, I started asking my poor mother questions that she just wasn't prepared to answer, like how did Noah get 27 million species on a 450-foot boat? And she just look at me like there's something wrong with you. And later on in life, I wanted to get to the bottom of that whole thing, so I did an extensive biblical study And I found out that a lot of the stories, in particular in the Old Testament, were actually can be traced to previous cultures. So I actually wrote a book about that, The Journey from Fundamentalism to Free Thinking, in the year 2000. I think I was like 45. And I was what I would consider an agnostic. I was brought up with the fundamentalism. I was taught that the Bible is the inerrant word of Almighty God. And I did my own research, and I just came to a different view. I still appreciate the biblical text, but I see it in a different way than the fundamentalists do, based on what I found in my research. And then, so I considered myself agnostic. I was curious if there was life after death. I was open-minded to it, but I was really what you would call a material reductionist, where consciousness is an epiphenomena of the brain. And when your brain shuts down, so does your consciousness. You're just unconscious forever. And that all changed on August the 18th. I started out in life with a sales career, and I switched midstream at the age of 37 and graduated when I was 42 with a bachelor's degree in occupational therapy. So I became a rehab manager in the therapy department in a local nursing home in Newcastle, Indiana here. And one morning I went to work as usual. The only thing I had on my mind was when I got off lunch, I wanted to go home and mow my grass. And at noon, I went home and mowed my grass, and that's when my life changed. If you want me to go into detail about the actual near-death experience, I can do that.
Well, we don't have to unless you want to, but I mean, it sounds, I mean, it's well laid out in your book about the experiences that you had as far as feeling that you kind of had the feeling that you might die, and then you actually did die, and then you went to a certain spot and had a message from some of your relatives. Do you want to go into that as far as the feelings that you got whenever you had that?
Yes. I started my lawnmower, and I went about 10 or 15 feet, and it was a nice hot August day here in Indiana. Sun was out, and I was going in the direction of the sun, and I just got hit with a wave of fatigue like I've never felt before in my life. And my first thought was that I was dehydrated. And so I went inside, and I got myself something to drink. And I went into my little room, turned the air conditioner on, kind of flip-flopped on the bed. And I really wanted to get my yard mowed so I can go back to work. So like a dummy, I went back outside and started the lawnmower up again. And I got another 10 or 15 steps. And that same feeling came over me, only about 10 times worse. And it just hit me, what was happening, that I was actually having a heart attack. I ruled out everything else in my head, and it's like, oh God, I'm having a heart attack. And surprisingly, I just didn't want to die and hit my head on the gravel. So I was kind of like going around in circles like a dog looking to do his business, because I wanted a nice soft space to lay down.
Mm-hmm.
And it hit me that I didn't have the time to do that. And for some reason, I was compelled to just stand there and look in the direction of the sun. And I knew I was going. This was it. And I was overwhelmed with feelings of curiosity, actually, because even though I was brought up fundamentalist and kind of moved into an agnostic stance, I was still open-minded whether there was actually something beyond this life. And I found out that day that we do live in a multidimensional existence, because it was just like I Googled on a computer, Russ is dying, and you know how associated links will pop up, and the most relevant first.
Mm-hmm.
What I found was a collection of entities that were gathering close to me. The most familiar ones to me were still living their life on Earth, and that really got my curiosity up. It's like in another city, living their life physically, but yet they're here with me to welcome me on the other side of the veil, and all I have to do is give into this. And the strangest part of all was there was actually an etheric version of myself, and that really freaked me out. There was a higher version. You've heard people refer to your higher self.
Right.
Well, I came pretty much face to face with that, and that shocked me. So I was all ready to go, and I was reassured that there was loved ones there. Now, later on, I would read books like The Journey of Souls by Dr. Michael Newton, and he described exactly, what I experienced. So that was very confirming that cross-culturally, other people have had very similar experiences. And of course, I read all the NDE theories about the ketamine and the endorphin release and all that. But until it actually happens to you, it's easy to buy into the standard scientific view of things, but then you get the subjective view, and it just changes the way you look at things. But what happened was I was all ready to just drop this life. It was like I would later learn that this was called the Oz factor in ufology, where it's totally silent and there was no cars on the road. The birds stopped. It was just like I was just like floating onto another world, almost like waking up from a dream.
Mm-hmm.
That I was quite familiar with. And I really quickly got a clairsentient. I now recognize it as a moment of clairsentience, that I had a choice to make, that they were there to welcome me to the other side, and I could do that. I was welcome to do that. But they were asking, are you sure you want to do it right now? Life on Earth is really fragile and precious, and you might want to live a little bit longer while you can. And I just instantly made up my mind when I got that message that I did, in fact, want to live. And I went into the house and got my keys to the car. And I was driving a triple black convertible Camaro, a 2000 Camaro. And I was really proud of that. And I drove myself to the hospital with total confidence that since I just had this experience and made the choice to live, that I wasn't going to die on the way to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
So I pulled up in front of the hospital and kind of went in with my keys, and I said, I'm having a heart attack. Would you park my car? And the guy was very, obliging, and they put me in a wheelchair, took me to a room. I got an IV, and the doctor said, morphine. And he explained to me that I was having a very bad heart attack and that they needed to get me up to Ball Hospital, which is about an hour away. So my first impression was, oh, good, I get to drive in an ambulance with the sirens going. I've never done that. And when they wheeled me out in the stretcher, the sun hit my face. I was just reassured once again, that I just had this experience with familiar people to me, and I had no fear whatsoever. I knew I was going to be fixed. So the doctor rubbed up, and they said, we've got two ways to go. We can do a quadruple bypass, or we can try a couple of stents. And I said, well, I don't know anything about either one of them. Can you give me a rundown on it? So after the rundown, I said, I'll take the stents. I'm not quite ready for the crab cracker operation, where they crank your chest open and do heart surgery. So
Right.
If I could get by with the two stents, I wanted to do that. And I found that really fascinating. I answered some of their questions. All the nurses were kind of laughing at me. I don't know what type of medication they had me on, but it was good. And I actually got to watch on a television screen how they were putting one stent in, and that went in successful, and then another one. But a strange thing happened after the stents were inserted. I spent one night in the hospital, and they wheeled me past somebody who was standing there who had actually shown up in my yard in etheric form. It was a woman that I'd broken up with about a year previously. We had dated for about 3 years, and both of us were married and divorced twice, and I just didn't want to go there again. So she needed to take the relationship to the next level, and I bailed. And she was standing there with her mascara running and tears running down her face because they wouldn't let her in because she wasn't family.
Right.
And as they rolled me past her, I said to myself, I'm going to fix this. One night in the hospital, and then they took me home, and she started coming over, to take care of me. And about a month and a half later, she and I flew to Las Vegas and got married by Dracula. And we've been a Dracula impersonator, not the real Dracula. But I was really happy that I decided to stay alive when I was doing that, too, because they had her in another room, and we're in Las Vegas. We're staying at the Stratosphere, and the smoke starts rolling over the stage, and the curtains pull, and this coffin comes out, and it creaks open, and this guy in whiteface pops out, and he's going to marry us. So they bring her in, and he does his little routine, and I was just thinking, I wouldn't want to miss this for the world, So we've had a wonderful 10 years of marriage, and plus this incident occurred, and it woke me up and shook me up. But what happened after this was I became very interested in, number one, accounts. I ran into Dr. Eben Alexander. He wrote Proof of Heaven, And this guy was a learned neurologist or a neurosurgeon who actually died and came back with an interesting story to tell. And his is one of many stories about NDE experiences about people that can identify things while they're having surgery. They're out of their body. And there's a whole entire body of information. Raymond Moody, I believe, is one of the other authors, Life After Life. And I just had to come to terms with what actually happened to me. But from there, after I started researching near-death experiences, I got a call. It was in 2012. This is 3 years after my heart attack and near-death experience. And it was from a friend of mine that Julie and I belonged to. And he was a ghost hunter. And he asked me if I wanted to spend the night at the Rhodes Hotel in Atlanta, Indiana, a real live house where they've had documented paranormal occurrences. And I'm still thinking from this old hardcore science view, you know, I'm probably just going to go there to watch paint dry. But what came out of my mouth was, sure, I'd love to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we set this up, and I spent the night in a ghost house, and I got to see all these people come in with their EVP equipment and full spectrum video cameras. And that really got me interested into this little subculture of people that are actively searching for something similar to what I had a face-to-face encounter with, you know.
Right.
So, you know, a human being that's passed on in ethereal form. So it really generated my interest. And I delved into the ghost research literature and found out all the different types of ghosts, you know, the lemurs, the etheric reverence, the vortexes, and animal ghosts, inanimate ghosts, and everything involved in the ghost literature. And then somewhere in my studies, I landed upon Kenneth Ring's book, The Omega Project. And what Kenneth Ring did was tie in near-death experiences with UFO abductions
Mm-hmm.
and alien abductions. And that was my first introduction or first glimpse that there might be some connection as a metaphenomena between ghosts, near-death experiences, and UFO encounters. So that really sent me sailing on I just fell into a rabbit hole with the UFO lore. And I was really shocked at what I discovered in the public domain that's available to anybody. You can start out with Dr. Jacques Vallée, John Keel, Timothy Good, Above Top Secret. And there's a lot of really good authors that have documented the classic UFO cases. So I'm reading along and all this, and I'm taking notes to myself because I naively thought that I could document every single classic case that's ever happened. And I found out soon that it receded from me, and it turned into thousands and thousands of documented cases. So at some point, I had this big pile of notes, and that's what actually got turned into the book that I published in 2016, Overlords of the Singularity.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's a strange title, but what I found was in the literature of the people that were grappling with this phenomena of close encounters of the third kind, like in 1954 alone, there was about 1,000 close encounters of the third kind where there's a landed flying disc and occupants coming out that people were reporting. So I was really curious as to what the nature of that experience was. And like most people, you start out with the extraterrestrial hypothesis. You think these are flying saucers or spaceships from another world. And then you soon discover with the writings of Keel and Lord Dowding and lots of other authors the interdimensional hypothesis. And in particular, Terence McKenna, who is kind of a psychonaut, he did a lot of entheogen adventures. And I always remember the phrase he said. He said, our visitors are disguising themselves as spaceships from another planet so as not to freak us out.
Right.
So that indicated that there might be a much more complex phenomena going on than simple visitors from other worlds. Not that there's not visitors from other worlds that pass by here from time to time, but there's also an adjacent phenomena that's deeply connected into the human unconscious, like Dr. Carl Jung thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really interesting, and we do have some people in the chat room that have said that they've had NDEs, near-death experiences, multiple times themselves, and I've found that you know I've almost died several times, Russell, myself, and it is an interesting thing, and I actually drew quite a lot of a correlation between your story and my story, because it was somewhat very similar in the fact that you start off with this religious background, and then and I was baptized in a very fundamentalist church in Ohio, and then after I moved to America, and I believed in all that. Then I became sort of this science nut, and thought, okay, well, you can explain all this by looking at this, and this is just, I thought for a long time that NDEs were just, hypoxia, your brain just, not having enough oxygen, so you're therefore starting to hallucinate and things like that. And then you go through the point where you start to realize that now there's more to this, and it's interesting because, and I don't know if you felt that way, but I kind of got the idea in the book, and I'm not criticizing you when you went on the ghost hunt, because I've done exactly the same thing, which is like, I really just don't want to go. I think, and you sort of get this sense of hubris, like, man, and I don't know if you feel that way, but I mean, I'm going to be honest and say sometimes I feel like I'm too intelligent for this. And I mean, and that's probably a really terrible thing to say, but, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, shows on cable don't allow for a very, very good discussion about a topic at times. And there's some sensationalism in it and everything else. And so you just feel like, man, I just don't want to be part of that. But then all of a sudden, whenever you're going through these different experiences, you start to realize that the universe is showing you things that you previously had poo-pooed. I mean, my wife can tell you. I mean, I always say that can't happen. And then, within a certain amount of time, it happens, and she laughs at me because I'm sort of that way. I've been pulled from sort of skeptic to believer, but not willingly, in a way. Mm-hmm. And so, I find that interesting about the way that you presented that in there too. Not that you were trying to say that these people are wrong or not, that they shouldn't be excited, but I like the fact that, and the thing that I got out of it is that the equipment itself can actually get in the middle or in between you and the thing that's trying to reach you. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that what you feel too? Is that?
Well, when I went to the ghost house in 2012, I had my foot in two worlds, because I had this deeply, profoundly spiritual, subjective experience in August of 2009, and my lifelong scientific skepticism. And when I went into the ghost house and I saw people that had ghost radar on their cell phones, just a ghost radar app, mm-hmm. and it was presenting words, what I sensed was they were taking this word, like it would say house or element or something like that, and they would strain their brain to try to fit it into something that they could make sense out of. But I ran into Dr. Dean Radden's work. He's the professor of noetic sciences out in California. And he's done a lot of work with human thought interacting with random number generators. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was thinking the whole time I was spent that night at the Rhodes House, was there's some mission that built a random word generator that's probably getting a big kick out of people using these devices to look for ghosts. And my sense is that you probably can't go out and look for a ghost. There's Joshua P. Warren is a paranormal investigator, and he explained it pretty well, that we're all like fish in an aquarium, and we're walking through this medium that we call space-time, and it's malleable. Albert Einstein equated it to a mollusk or an oyster. It's flexible and gelatinous. A little glitch in the matrix, and you may encounter something that's like, whoa, did I just see that, or am I going crazy? But to go out and actively look for a ghost, still to this day, I'm not sure that that's really possible. Maybe it is, and I just haven't been exposed to the right group are the right information. But Dr. Dean Radden's work with random number generators convinced me that there is a way that human thought can interact with random word generators. And he's got a really good white paper on the internet and some peer-reviewed science about this. And he does other work like hooking somebody up to machines and finding out that the way their brain lights up, he can tell which choice they're going to make about 5 seconds before they actually make it, which means somebody else is really running the show. When we have a thought come to our conscious mind, it's already been decided by another or a higher part of us beforehand. Even if I decide to get up and walk from point A to point B, all the mathematical calculations of all the different muscles have already been put together ahead of time. So there's something very, very complex, almost a technological sense that I get of how we move through this medium and interact with it. And so Dr. Dean Radden was very helpful mind about the credulity that you're worried about falling into. And I like what you said about some aspects of the phenomena being beneath you, because I actually thought that for a long time. I relegated UFOs to the science fiction, and I text cards, 1962 bubblegum cards when I was 8 years old, and I still do. I get graded sets. But at some point in the literature, when you're looking through the UFO material and examining all the people, credible people that have had encounters with the strange and walked into the Twilight Zone one day, you have an aha moment, and it hits you like a rock. This phenomena is real. I don't know all the details, and I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of questions, but the phenomena is real, and by gum, I'm going to learn as much about it as I possibly can for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that in a lot of ways, there's this idea that in a lot of ways, and you talked about John Keel and Ivan T. Sanderson in the book, kind of coming up with the idea of like a flesh and blood Sasquatch, for example, and then a spiritual Sasquatch, which is kind of what I think too, but with UFOs, I think it's the same thing. Some of the things that are UFOs that we're seeing may be unidentified to us, but it may be of man's construction, something that we don't know. And then you've got this sort of other experience that people have that seems to be completely non-nuts and bolts, and it's a completely different thing. So when you're talking about the machine mind, the sort of as Descartes, I think, said, the deus ex machina, the ghost in the machine, is that how you kind of see ourselves as being something that that has no free will, or somebody's controlling us, or is it more? You remember the wave and the particle experiment that they used?
Right.
The split slot experiment.
Double slit experiment.
Yeah, and I have problems with S's. But anyway, but the whole point of it is that you can by observing the experiment itself, you can change the outcome prior to it happening. In other words, it's a beam or a particle or a wave. And I've talked to a lot of Buddhists that talk about things like time travel and different things like that. That what's happening is of course, everybody says you can't travel faster than light. However, waves can't travel faster than light, but particles can. So basically, if you can stand out with your body and observe your body, then you should technically be able to think it anywhere in the universe. So I'm going to ask you to be a little philosophical here at this point in time. I hope you don't mind. Do you think that it's your higher self that is then making that determination, as you gave the example before, or is it something you think it's something else? In other words, if we have 2 or 3 states of matter, a higher being and an earthly being. Do you think that that something else is creating it, or do you think that it is sort of like a matrix where somebody has just created the universe and we are, basically Sims in a machine that has a pre-programmed response to things?
Well, that's a multifaceted barrage of questions there. I'll start out going back on the interdimensional nature of Sasquatch.
Mm-hmm.
The first person that I ran across in the literature was John Eric Beckjord, that speculated that Sasquatch, what we call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, was actually an interdimensional creature. And of course, he was lampooned terribly for his belief in that. But now it's rather mainstream. John Keel and all his investigations, he went all the way to Tibet and looking for Yeti, and he heard the call, but he didn't see one. And he concluded that there's both, that there's a flesh and blood, elusive humanoid ape-like creature that has so far evaded capture. And there's also an interdimensional version with the red eyes that sometimes leaves a sulfur smell that so many people have had an interaction with. And it's very, very similar to the UFO phenomena, because there's a lot in the Bigfoot literature. I was really surprised how extensive that is, how many encounters of Bigfoot sightings there actually are. And in some of the cases, they've actually been shot at, and the creature disappears into a flash of light.
Mm-hmm.
And they go find the footprints, and the footprints will go along for a while and simply disappear. And sometimes there's a little puddle of silicon carbide, which looks like furnace slag left behind. And that's the same thing that you see in the trace evidence cases with UFOs. There's a little puddle of furnace slag. So there does seem to be a flesh and blood version and an interdimensional version connected to the. And there's a fellow that I met named Kevin Estrella who is really into this. I met him at the Stargate to the Cosmos conference last November. He's actually a guitar player with the Pyramids of Mars, and he believes they're one and the same. Instead of Keel's dualistic view, the Bigfoot is actually an interdimensional who can appear as a flesh and blood. And I've looked at the Patterson film extensively, and I think it's authentic from all the evidence that I've looked at. But philosophically, I would make reference to the raw material, the Law of One material that David Wilcock quotes so often. I took the time to read those volumes by Don Elkins and Carla Ruckert. And there was some stuff that she channeled that actually correlated with my near-death experience very well regarding my higher self. And according to this body of material, all of us have a sixth-density higher self that exists in what we call the distant future, that is attempting, it's like it has goals of its own. It's attempting to reach the next level, which is 7D, or the portal to the cosmic supermind, and it needs to gain the experience and the lessons to achieve its own goals. So it's almost like the old Hermetic axiom, as below, so above, because an electron exists in a state of superposition, meaning two states simultaneously. One is the objective measured version of the electron that's in the atom, and the other exists simultaneously in a larger expanded probability field. And if you apply that to humans, we could look at our temporary physical lives here as being in superposition, just like the electron, with a higher version of ourselves that's interdimensional and has access to information that we don't have access to with our limited perceptual equipment. Aldous Huxley said it best. He said that our brain more acts like a governor than it does an information retrieval system, because he says it's very limiting as to what we can see. We only see a certain bandwidth from ultraviolet to infrared right in there, and there could be intelligences all around us that exist in the upper or lower ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that are invisible to us, but they're just as real as we are.
Right.
They just exist on a different frequency band of reality. And the thing about the Law of One material, I sort of go by what John Keel said. He said belief is the enemy. But I'm open to everything. I'll read and listen to anybody's testimony without judgment, and I just file it, because I think if it doesn't make sense to me now, maybe someday when I have more information, it will make sense. And the one thing that the NDE did was it opened my mind to things that I would have just rejected right off the bat, because my brain says that's not real. And now I've just expanded my repertoire of possibilities when you get into like the people in the secret space program testimonies that really stretches your ability to accept. Just listen without judgment. And just found out Randy Kramer actually passed a lie detector test. So a lot of these secret space program testifiers are reporting memories that are actually in their mind. However they got there, they're reporting from visual memory. They've passed body language experts, polygraph tests, you name it. So I'm very open, but I'm reluctant to just like swallow something hook, line, and sinker right off the bat. Reject it or accept it. Just gather information and see if you can put some pieces together. That's my philosophy.
Yeah, I think you're completely right, because I almost think that it's, in a way, it's a funny thing. Whenever I was growing up in Ireland, we had a religious upbringing, but we also had a very superstitious, what people would call a very superstitious kind of lifestyle as well. In some cases, and things like fairies were real, and that's all cool, because again, it's one of those things where Jacques Vallée says, that's probably the same type of things that we're dealing with now. And over time, I think I've come to that conclusion. But, it was interesting that my great granny, who was about 4'5" and, the scariest woman I've ever met, but, because she just had a piercing way of explaining things. I mean, she was not kind at all. I mean, it was just one of those things where it was just like, it was very, very matter of fact. And so, I remember telling her one time, I don't want to go up there because it's dark. And she says, well, there's nothing in the dark that isn't there during the daytime. If you see what I'm saying. In other words, she believed that we were being surrounded by beings all the time. And it doesn't really matter if you're not seeing it in the night or if you're not seeing it in the day, it's still there. And that's one of the things that we are dealing with. And it does come down to that idea of our senses really betraying us in a lot of ways. And I've spent a lot of times looking for Sasquatch over the years. And I've come to the realization that because our senses are so limited, a Sasquatch could be, half the time I'm walking through the Cascade Mountains and realizing that if it's quiet and it doesn't make any noise, it could be 3 feet away from me and I can't see it. The way that the camouflage is, that's just the way it is. And so the possibilities of all these different things are things that we don't think about. People just say, oh, well, I've never seen one and I do this and I go hunting and everything like that. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it is, if you talk to a lot of people who are out there or have spent a lot of time in nature and things like that, they tend to agree that, nature is weird in the way that it is. And it's not weird. It's not strange for them to see things that to most of us who live in the city now, would dismiss as not being possible. It's an interesting thing. Linda Moulton Howe did a lot of research on Bigfoots that, I think it was on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, and the guy raised this 30-30 up to try to shoot the Sasquatch, and it disappeared. And so these things do happen, and I don't know what causes that phenomenon. I guess it's not even really the point. I mean, that's whenever I talk to my Buddhist friends, that's what he always says, is that's not even the point. That's not even nothing's ever the point. But the idea is that that we're getting to understand the nature of our, would you call it a circular existence then, in a way, that there is no time, in the fact that do you think that we live multiple lives maybe in the same space and time, or you?
Possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, there may in fact be a true multiverse. If you look into the writings of theoretical physicists like Michio Kaku, or Italian physicist, he's a loop quantum gravity theorist, Carlo Rovelli. Rovelli wrote 2 really good books. One is called Reality is Not What It Seems,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is The Order of Time. And I learned a lot about time itself in both of his books. I turned 64 today, and I'm happy to be here talking to you. This is like the best birthday I've had in a long time, but I learned a lot about time reading his books. I didn't even never consider things like time flows slower on the surface of the earth than it does in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go more and more to the core or the center of the earth, time slows, opens up possibilities that, well, if there are populations that are closer to the core of the earth, time is flowing slower for them. So they could be down there, say, for a year by their time and come up here and 100,000 years has passed.
Yeah.
I've been trying to get a hold of Carlo Rovelli on Facebook to ask him that question, if he knows of any mathematical formulas that would calculate how much slower time goes. Let's say it's about 4,000 miles to the center of the earth. Let's say somebody lives 2,000 or 3,000 miles down there. How fast is time flowing for them? And the shocking thing is that what we call our present moment, our whole science is based on the idea that the only thing that's objectively real is what we call our present moment, which lasts a couple of nanoseconds. The past is gone. The future hasn't happened. The thing that's objectively real is this thing that we're calling the present. But what Rovelli pointed out was that what we call our present moment is not shared by the rest of the universe. And that's a mind blower. I mean, because out there in the universe, if you get next to a black hole, time can actually stop.
Right.
Or millions of years are passing. And Albert Einstein, he equated it to the mollusk. It's very flexible. And depending on the gravitation of the bodies that you're coming near to will depend on how time is flowing. A lot of it depends on your perceptual apparatus. Like, even as a child, I always wondered that when a fly that by our perception is going zzz, that in its own world, it's just taking its merry time, that its wings are going really slow. So time isn't what we think it is, and it's a lot more malleable and a lot more flexible than we normally think of it. Our intuition says that our present moment is the same here on Earth as it is on Andromeda, and that the question's actually meaningless because time is not the same on Andromeda as it is here. Even if somebody was to send a radio signal from Mars, the transmission itself would exist in our present moment in an expanded present of about 15 minutes, and it's only when we receive the signal that we could consider that transmission in our past.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was a signal sent from Andromeda, then you're talking a million years of expanded present. So the idea of an expanded present and the fact that time flows differently all throughout the physical universe, it reminds me of what Keel pointed out in the is that whenever they came in contact with the ufonauts, they always asked what time cycle they were on.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of made sense. But going back to the raw material of information that correlated with my own personal near-death experience, for example, philosopher David Chalmers came up with Dr. Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis. He called it the mind-body hypothesis. He's renamed it the matrix hypothesis, where he conceives of a higher self version in another dimension that's receiving information from our physical life. And it's a two-way street. We receive information from our higher self. In fact, that may be what people are actually praying to. They think they're praying to an omnipotent father, but it's actually the higher version of themselves that they're addressing and can get assistance in various ways through that. But David Chalmers thought that there was a two-way communication going on between an interdimensional higher version of ourselves, and both of those versions correlate with Dr. Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis. He postulates that somewhere in the distant future, in a post-singularity civilization, we're running ancestor simulations, and that's what the physical universe and our life here is we're actually like in a room somewhere, using some sort of technology to produce this experience here on Earth as an ancestor simulation. So if you add up what Dr. Nick Bostrom from Oxford University is saying, combined with David Chalmers' matrix hypothesis, combined with Carla Ruckert's channeled material from the Law of One, there's a real confirmation and a correlation there. They're all basically saying the same thing. And then you've got pieces of information like the declassified British Condign report. It's 450 pages long, and it says that there's a plasma-like phenomena on Earth that we don't understand very well that seems to have some intelligence level of its own and interacts with the human psyche in really bizarre ways. So, and before in our conversation, Kevin, you mentioned fairies.
Mm-hmm.
And it may very well be that throughout the ages, all of these presentations that people have reported seeing and experiencing, like phantom armies or flying chariots or fairies or flying shields, like Alexander the Great and his army reported. Some of his soldiers dropped to their knees and shot their bows and arrows at it. All the flying shields that appeared in a battle there might be various manifestations of the exact same intelligence, possibly indigenous to the earth and connected in with the human collective unconsciousness, like Carl Jung thought.
Right.
So these may be, they're not operating like hallucinations, like in the normal scientific understanding of hallucinations, but there's like a separate intelligence that exists here in our reality that's capable of interacting with the human unconsciousness and producing these manifestations based on our own psychological and spiritual evolution. So just like Terence McKenna said, the spaceships from other worlds, that may be because we're in the scientific age of computers and rocket ships and everything, and that's just our interpretation that we're placing on it. And it makes me wonder that if in 200 years, an entirely different paradigm may be observed and reported and documented that's the same intelligence, but it's no longer spaceships from another world. It's something else that possibly we can't even imagine.
Right.
And another aspect of that was all of the classic researchers like Dr. Jacques Vallée, who thought the phenomena was a control mechanism on the human psyche, and Keel that went from the extraterrestrial hypothesis to the interdimensional hypothesis. They all seem to think that there's a technological aspiration involved here. Keel wrote a book called The Eighth Tower that was a big hit in England. He got poo-pooed with that book in the United States because at the time he wrote it, everybody was entrenched in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and they threw rocks at him for that. But in the last chapter of The Eighth Tower, he pretty much spells out that there may be an intelligence on Earth that once upon a time were the gods to us, who were in flesh here on Earth and that we looked at as gods, who for some reason went underground, undersea, off planet, in another dimension, and they're trying to use us as proxies to recreate their super science.
Mm-hmm.
The late Jim Marrs said exactly the same thing in his book, Our Occulted History, that somebody's trying to recreate their super science. So everything in the literature indicated that part and parcel of the UFO phenomena is a technological inclination infused in the human race to get us to this projected event that futurists are calling the Singularity, which Ray Kurzweil and Larry Page and all the techno-optimists are saying could happen as soon as 2025 or somewhere between 2045 and 2080, when sentient artificial superintelligence is around. We share the planet with artificial superintelligence. And it may actually be, in my mind, that we need electronically augmented intelligence to even understand what this intelligence is or who our visitors are. Our current biological perceptual equipment may not be sufficient to correctly identify what we're dealing with. So one of the things I'm looking forward to as we move forward into what they're calling the technological singularity is this idea of augmented intelligence, brain chips, and whole brain emulation, where you can upload your brain into a computer system, and so that maybe we can understand a lot more of the full super spectrum, as John Keel called it, whereas right now with our biological perceptual equipment, we're very limited in what we can understand or perceive.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to grab a hold of, and I think that's one of those things where it really does sort of, I don't know, begs the question that a lot of people don't, because they're so into Newtonian science and not necessarily quantum mechanics, don't realize a couple things. Whereas there's a lot of assumptions. Obviously, Newton came up with the idea for gravity, but not the idea for gravity. He didn't prove gravity existed, but he came up with the constant idea of what gravity is. But again, whenever you were talking about time being different, a lot of that has to do with gravity being different, because we figure out that if you look at on the on a map of the world, and you notice slight differences in gravity, that changes time and the way that you perceive time. And it's very interesting to me that most people don't know that. I'm trying to think of who I could put you in contact with, but there was I knew of a group of people who had measured gravity throughout England, and it varied by altitude. It varied by different minuscule amounts of gravity differences. But the thing that is also true is that the shielding of the Earth itself, some type of geology and everything, actually causes gravity to be minusculely different, and that changes the perception of time, and not in a way that you as a person could know that, but we are talking about billions of years here. We're not talking about my lifetime. I mean, it doesn't really work out that way. But if I can remember who that is, Russell, I'll send you that information, because I think that would help you in that. I just wanted to get that out of the way. And then the other thing that I kind of wanted to take a look at is and let me just see how to word this the best way and the most accurate way. Do you find that when you're dealing with these different things that there's no one perfect solution for the problem? In other words, a lot of these ideas that people come up with are hypotheses, and it sounds like you are blending together, which I really like about you. You're blending together a lot of different philosophies into one that works for you. Is that how you kind of look at it? In other words, what I really like about your methodology and the way that you think is that you do take things and make a connection versus the average person who maybe looks at that and doesn't make the connection. I think that the key thing about your mind and what I like about it is, I mean, I just imagine you being in a room with the pictures and the yarn that goes between the different things in your room, and it's like, okay, well, that connects to this and that connects to that, and is that kind of how your brain functions? Or whenever you're hearing about a certain thing, are you always thinking, well, that seems like this, but I disagree with it in this sort of a way, or whatever? I mean, it seems to me like you should be, and again, I recommend that people read your book, because I think it's fascinating, but you should be the guy who's presenting on these different types of things, because you stand on the shoulders of giants, but you're actually creating something new that's yours and yours alone.
Well, there's my life is divided into pre-2009 and post-2009, because I wasn't a big reader prior to my near-death experience. One of the reasons I didn't read much is because I thought I knew everything already. I knew pretty much everything you need to know. When you die, you're dead, and UFOs and Bigfoot and all that, that's all BS, and that's it. And what I found out was that all these things were not beneath me, they were actually above me.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to start reading. I went from maybe reading one book a year, if that, to like 300 books in the course of 2 or 3 years. I just absorbed it like a sponge. I had to laugh at David Wilkins. First got into flying saucers. He couldn't look at a manhole cover without thinking of a flying saucer, and I can really relate to how he felt about that, because everything reminded me of it. And but yeah, my methodology since '09 was to open my mind to everything, and if something immediately resonates with me, I accept it and incorporate it, and usually they'll have a couple of connections to other material. But if it doesn't, instead of rejecting it, I just file it. I just set it on the shelf. And there's several things that I felt this inner rejection from that this isn't real. And then later on, like 20 or 30 books later, it would make sense to me.
Right.
So you can, your analogy with the yarn or the string is really good, because I've got that going on inside my head, I think, from one book to another, just, making these little connections. And hopefully the picture will get bigger over time.
Yeah, I think that's, a fascinating type thing. Well, we're up against the break right now, Russell. So I'm gonna play this music for about 7 minutes. I'm gonna let you know, because like I said, when we started out this, I didn't get to tell you this, but this plays for 7 minutes and some seconds. When you come back, when you hear the twangy Western music, that means that we're about to come back. So if you're outside getting a drink or going to the bathroom or something like that, then that's what's going on. And I know I've got several people who want to talk to you. I'm going to open up the phone lines when we get back as well. And I think it's a fascinating thing. But again, we've gone through a lot of meat right here, and so people probably need 7 minutes just to chill out themselves and kind of put that all in perspective, because you have thrown up a lot of different ideas that are incredibly brave and intelligent. So we'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay.
You are listening to On the Other Hand with Kevin Beegle on the We Are Paradox Media Network. You can find the show on Facebook at We Are Paradox Media. Also, you can hear the show on Spreaker Radio by searching We Are Paradox Media. The show will be returning shortly. We have taken a break for station affiliation. This is a live show, and the call-in number is 360-548-7070. You are listening to On the Other Hand with Kevin Beegle on the We Are Paradox Media Network. You can find the show on Facebook at We Are Paradox Media. Also, you can hear the show on Spreaker Radio by searching We Are Paradox Media. The show will be returning shortly. We have taken a break for station affiliation. This is a live show, and the call-in number is 360-548-7070. And you missed Russell doing a little jig there in the because we were on a break. Okay, so and I'm going to add this. I'm going to add this in here so that people do know the number. Again, it's the call-in number is 360-548-7070. So if you'd like to give a call in, but I did want to say I didn't forget that it was your birthday, Russell, and so
yeah, I'm 64 today.
64 today, and we can't play things that are like I guess branded songs, but I can on my little Casio keyboard here do covers. So hold on just a second here, Russell. I got something for you. I don't know if you could hear that.
I could hear it.
That's the best that Casio has to offer. Yo, Russell, it's your birthday. There you go. Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right.
Now my face is purple.
Yeah, I know. So, back to the matter at hand. Now, whenever we were talking about some different things as far as the idea, you were talking about you went through this different research, and then you were trying to document. And you said it was very, very difficult, and I imagine it is, trying to document all these different reports that people have. Now, is that something that you still try to do as far as that goes? Are you trying to be the omnibus or the nexus of all this information, or is that something that you don't do anymore?
No, I think Richard Dolan does a really good job as a UFO historian, and I'll look into every single blessed case that's ever happened, in modern times. The reason that I was documenting all these cases, I was still in the process of determining whether there was any reality to the UFO phenomenon, and I found an old flying saucer crash case in Max, Nevada in the 1800s. And I looked into Leonard Stringfield's material. He's got 6 status reports. He's like the sleuth of flying saucer crashes. And I've got my own take on that whole phenomenon. But yeah, I just kept a personal notebook, and, I'd write down like the Cache Landrum, where they were in Texas and they came upon a diamond shaped craft, and they actually got radiation burns from it. And they dug up a piece of the street to hide the evidence, and looked into Project Red Light, where they have the secret fleet of unmarked helicopters that show up at scenes like that. The crash retrieval teams. I made friends with Clifford Stone. I had a 3-hour conversation on the telephone with him one night. And how this whole thing and the radio and public exposure got started was when I published my book in the printed form after the Kindle. I posted it on Clifford Stone's Facebook page, and got a hold, and Janet and Dr. Sasha Lesson got a hold of me and started that. So I was really glad that there was an interest out there, and that's one of the other aspects of this whole thing is I've come into contact with an entire subculture of people that have accepted the UFO phenomena as absolutely real, and they're trying to figure out the details and what it means to humanity. And it's really nice I like going to these conventions just for the conversations that you have and the people that you meet. It's really great.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I did one, the Stargate to the Cosmos, with the lessons, and met some of the secret space program contactees, the testifiers, and all sorts of interesting people that were into the quantum physics, like you were saying. And there's really my concept prior to '09 of the Newtonian physics and the concept of objective reality. That died in 1930. I just never got the memo. When Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein were working on all this quantum stuff, and they came to the conclusion that reality itself was observer dependent, and you had the double slit experiment. You had phenomena like quantum entanglement, quantum tunneling, and superposition that all fit into the larger picture. There really isn't any such thing as objective reality. Carlo Rovelli, states that emphatically in his books. That it sort of melts. There's actually an equation that he brings up called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, and it's an attempt to mathematically combine the macrocosmos with the micro world of subatomic particles, and it only works if you eliminate time. And what Rovelli and some of the other theoretical physicists are saying is that underneath this facade, what the Hindus call Maya, the great illusion, the matrix, whatever you want to call it, is a sea of quantum events in which time is non-existent. So space-time itself is the gravitational field, and it's also an emergent phenomena from this underlying sea of quantum events in a timeless realm. And we can try to imagine what a timeless realm would be like, but we get lost. We just really can't do it with our little brains. And when it comes to concepts like reincarnation, I thought, okay, if this universe has been around for 13.5 billion years, and this is as far as I've gotten, what's wrong with this picture? What have I been doing?
Yeah,
that goes into the whole probability aspect of it. You bounce in and out of superposition with the field. Lynn McTaggart wrote a book called The Field and does a really good job of translating all this high-level mathematics that the physicists are coming up with into layman's terms, and she uses really good analogies. But there is a field, a quantum field, beyond what we call material reality, in which time is meaningless.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, and that's the part of a lot of things that people don't necessarily understand is that, I think 4 to 5% of our universe is observable, probably 5% roughly. And, 20, so you've got real matter, you've got dark matter, which doesn't mean that it's an evil entity. It just means that dark matter makes up about 25% of the universe, and then you've got dark energy, which makes up the 70, the other parts of it. So it is interesting that when we're really talking about it, there's no void in space as we think of it. There's lots of stuff out there, and we just can't see it. Okay, I do have a call here, and I'm going to put her on the phone. It's Sam, and let's see.
Oh.
Sam?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you both. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Sam.
I'm Kevin's wife, and
oh, okay.
I'm just so fascinated with everything you've been talking about. You've touched on a lot of things that have happened to me, paranormal lately, and I just don't know where to begin. But one of the things that you talked about with the Bigfoot being, in this realm and out, I had an experience where I saw, it's an area where Kevin and I go, and we've seen physical Sasquatch and or Bigfoot. But this time I felt like something was watching me. I looked over, and there was, in the shape of a big, giant, hairy man, was a being made out of, I call it plasma, but it was like a dense, gray, thick cloud, not moving like smoke or cloud, but kind of like a smoke or shadow being, which I learned later is a thing, but, just like a 3D gray being. And as soon as I looked at him, stepped behind a tree, behaved like the Bigfoot do, and then he was the first time I ever thought to ask them what they were. And so I just telepathically said, what are you? And he said, extraterrestrial. And then with the telepathy, that was a clear word, which, it usually doesn't come through so clearly. But when I started thinking of space, stars and galaxies and stuff, then it was kind of like an afterthought, was like, and terrestrial, like, here but not here. So I kind of think he was trying to convey that it was another realm or dimension. But I had a experience where I was meditating, and when I opened my eyes, all of the things in our world, the man-made things, the building, the second floor that I was on, everything looked like that in gray. The people, the chairs, table were all in that gray shape, and then there was a giant Technicolor tree. With your vast knowledge, do you have any insight and thoughts on that, or?
Well, yeah, I had several thoughts as you were speaking. First of all, your description of the plasma-like presentation with the gray appearance, it really is reminiscent of the entities that showed up when I was having a heart attack. In former conversations, I've described them as intelligent lightning, and in transition and between worlds and another realm, all the things that you mentioned were the same attributes that I would give to the entities that showed up to me to welcome me to the other side. And then Dr. Michael Newton's Journey of Souls material, where he hypnotized people in between lifetimes, they occasionally would talk about interactions with extraterrestrials. So this realm that we go to when we pass is where a lot of what we call extraterrestrials operate from. And it may be to effectively traverse this universe, you have to bypass space-time as we understand it and go into a hyperspace dimension where you have access to all points in time and space, and you can go anywhere you want. I, for one, would love to get out there and be able to effectively move around the physical universe. It's a vast place, and I'm really curious as to what all's going on out there. But that's what came to mind when you were speaking, anyways, the correlation that I had with my own experience. And so a lot of the stuff that's in the literature. There's a really famous contactee case called the Friendship Group. A group of over 200 Italians back in 1956 interacted with a group of humanoids from various places in the universe. At least that's how they describe themselves. But there's a really enigmatic photo online about a light being coming up out of a underground tunnel, and it sort of reminded me of that. And I've seen other photographs of like light beings sitting on the camera on film. In fact, there's a Facebook friend that's just about all she does is post pictures that she takes with her cell phone, and there's some really amazing presentations, like humanoid forms that are just like a white blur. And we interact with that realm probably all the time, and every once in a while some of us have an experience that comes to our conscious attention. Nikola Tesla believed that there were invisible entities walking around us all the time. So there's a lot of really genius people really that believe in coexist in the same realm that we're operating in. We just can't perceive them. So there's a whole hidden world.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And a lot of your story is similar to mine. I was raised very religious. I was raised in the Mormon church, and one thing that they did teach us from early on is that when we die, we go to the spirit world, which is here on the earth with us. We can't see them and they can't see us. There's a veil between us. So, I was grateful to have that, kind of different perspective than maybe other religions, because it opened me up to when I started having these experiences recently, to think of maybe, some of the things that we see aren't actually what they are. For example, this is another thing, like I'm not sure if you have experience with this, but I just started sending energy to people, and I didn't have any training or anything, but I would just put my hand up to the computer or think of their face or picture and then just put my hand up and send out energy. And each time the experience has been very different. But in this one instance, I was sending energy to someone that I knew, and he was a very sweet man. I didn't know it at the time, but he was terminally ill, and he since has passed. But I was just going to send the energy, and all of a sudden I was floating over him, and he was laying in bed. And it's like in a dream where you can't move, you don't have control. It was like that, but I had just closed my eyes to meditate. It wasn't a deep meditation or any kind of preparation. I think it was the emotion that sent me there, and I'm just thinking, is this real? Is this really happening, or just my imagination? And I tried to get back to my body. I was aware of my body, but I could only see him, and I was floating over him. And then I, was worried he was going to see me. And when he turned and looked at me, he had the shock look on his face, like, I knew he could see me in that, spirit form or whatever. And then I instantly was back in my room, and I was, kind of in shock, like, did that really happen? So I just sent him the information I got from the healing, that, what was wrong. And I was, again, every time I'm always shocked with the information I get, and that people validate it. But he said the next day that when I was working on him, there was a fairy in his room, and when he turned to look at her, she disappeared. What do you think that could be? Was there a part of me that was a fairy in his room? Is that how he perceived the energy? What are some different theories you might think regarding that?
Okay. Well, first of all, if it is true, as I tend that we're in sort of a state of superposition where we're here physically, that exists in a timeless realm, that has thoughts and aspirations of its own that we could barely understand, these aspects of ourselves interact with one another in this realm. Because when they showed up to me on August 18th, 2009, they were in like waves of groups. And it's like the first one was people that were still living their life here on Earth. And then there was other people that I couldn't really identify, but I had a really strong sense of familiarity with them, but I couldn't place a positive ID on them. And it completely changed the way that I look. I'm an occupational therapist in a nursing home. And prior to my NDE, when I would see an old person, let's say 90 years old in a wheelchair, and they've lost all their function and they've lost their mind, I really thought, oh, how sad that is. I look at it completely different now, because there's this other higher dimensional aspect of them that's using their current life experience. When they were younger, what this higher aspect of their self might have been doing was learning lessons on how to give love to other people. And now that they're incapacitated, it's a matter of receiving. The higher aspect of the self is gleaning information, just like David Chalmers says, from this life experience in an incapacitated state. And I've also seen people in their last conversation right before they pass. And a lot of times I'll go into somebody's room, and I know when they're going to go, because their eyes are rolling around inside their eyelids. And sometimes they're even talking to somebody that I can't see. So it is possible to be in your physical body, but an aspect of your psyche is actually interacting with a being in a different realm. And sometimes Rudolf Steiner thought, he wrote a book called The Dead Are With Us, and thought that you could communicate with the deceased through your dream life. And I've had a certain amount of experiences with that, with people who have passed on, that I've had communications in my dreams with. So that's interesting. But yeah, the bottom line of all of this is we're enmeshed in an interdimensional reality, and there's overlap involved and little glitches in the matrix, and you just have to accept the adventure of it all.
Yeah, there's a lot. I see Kevin laughing.
I'm not laughing. There was somebody
passed on.
No, somebody commented.
No, I mean just
no, Sam. Somebody commented.
But,
yeah, somebody commented just this is how most conversations go between us. But no, somebody commented in the chat room that I wasn't smiling, and that's just. And I have to say that I am blind in one eye, so I have to concentrate very hard, and so that's what it is. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sam.
Well, I was just thinking that there was my father, when he was 84, his heart stopped for a half an hour, and he was brought back to life, and he's going to have his 86th birthday next month. But during that half an hour, there was a presence in my room, and I kind of made a rule, like no ghost can come to my room unless it's somebody I know, because at the time I was afraid. And there was just, once I opened up and accepted this, like there was objective and subjective things that were happening. Like it wasn't just in my mind. There was physical things, people elsewhere, things I was seeing that was verified somewhere else. And so, I didn't even turn to look at, because it was just, things weren't allowed to pop up in my room. And Kevin came in and he saw a being standing behind me, and watched him walk out through the wall. And the only message that I got was just peace. It wasn't like, I was trying to identify what kind of energy it was. And I didn't even think to turn around and look behind me, but, Kevin saw it. And it was exactly during the time he found out the day my father had the heart attack, that it was during that half an hour that he was, had his near-death experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Russell. That was very, very strange, and she's outing me on the radio again. But
sorry.
But what happens is, I came into the room and there was a being that was standing behind her and had just basically looked at me. I said, "Sam, is that you?" Because again, I have some problems seeing. And then this thing just turned around, walked right through the door. Through the wall of the bathroom, and it was just it was crazy. But from that standpoint, it is strange that and that when you experience these things, and also what is interesting is have you when you went through your experience, did anybody claim that you had visited them or that you had? Because I've heard a lot of reports of people who have seen people after they die, right before they go to wherever they go. I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, somebody came to me. They said everything's going to be all right. There's something after this, and just don't worry about it. Just don't worry about me. Is that a very common thing that people want to come to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the common thing that came to mind was the sense of peace and that there's nothing to worry about. I completely lost my fear of death. I still don't like pain. I avoid pain, but I'm not afraid at all. In fact, I actually look forward and embrace my next exit point. I'm what they call a no code in the nursing home, where if I'm out, just let me
Mhm.
go. And I don't want to be brought back next time. I want to make a different decision. I made the decision in '09 to stick around and live some more, and I've corrected some things. One of the things that hit me on the way to the hospital was that there's relationships in this world that I needed to correct. And without going into a lot of detail, I put some energy into
Mhm.
contacting these individuals and spending time with them and correcting the little glitches that were between us. And that's been resolved. So the next time that I'm on the precipice of walking through that veil, especially if there's the same cluster of entities waiting for me, I'm going to cave into that and go. And I'm greatly looking forward to that. And I have absolutely no fear of death whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that that's a very common thing. Now,
Yeah.
thanks, Sam. Thanks for calling. And
Thank you, and I've really enjoyed talking to you, Russell, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again. And again, happy
Anytime, Sam.
birthday.
You
yeah,
can message me on Facebook.
yeah.
I,
What I think is interesting is that, yeah, like I said, we have both been listening to this book, and of your book for the last week. And what was interesting about it is that I know that she would ask you completely different questions that I did, and so I wanted her to call in. But the interesting thing about that, whenever she was talking about her Mormon or LDS baptism, that several people in the chat also say that they were baptized as LDS, and are really getting into what you're having to say. Now, it doesn't mean that they're still practicing in the church, but have you found that? Now, let me ask you this, because it's an awkward question that a lot of people, maybe are not comfortable answering. But has anybody in your family sort of disowned you for coming to this conclusion, or is it, or have said, well, that's not the way that it should be, so therefore, or are they understanding of your experiences and just say, okay, well, that's Russell's point of view or whatever? Because I've had situations where sometimes people will say to me, that's what you're saying is not, technically, what they believe. Have you found that sort of resistance in your family, or are they pretty much okay?
Yes. There's one person in particular that I shared, pretty much the same plane of scientific thinking and rationale with, that pretty much has written me off, that I've taken a journey into La La Land.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand where they're coming from, because I've been there. I know that mindset. And science has almost become like a religion. It's got their own high priests, and they've got their own dogma. And if you go beyond that, it's almost like a cult. You'll get excommunicated. And I just reached a point where I'm just going to stand in my own truth and tell people, if they ask me what I truly think about things. And if they can accept it, fine. If not, fine. The one thing I get a big kick out of is my scientifically oriented friends, that if I am in a group conversation and the subject of UFOs or Bigfoot or anything like that comes up, they'll just raise their hand and say, I'm a scientist, and just, and they have absolutely no. There are Green, he's PhD level Sasquatch researcher. There's scientists who are state directors of MUFON. Dr. Jacques Vallée was a brilliant scientist that helped map Mars and do all kinds of real technical computer-oriented stuff. So the people that consider themselves in this scientific bent, where they just not going to go beyond certain paradigm, they haven't examined the literature. And one thing I find curious amongst the hardcore UFO skeptics is that they haven't cracked the first book.
Mm.
They already know that it's fiction, so they haven't even examined the evidence. And that in and of itself is a very unscientific approach to any subject, because what I tell people that are of that paradigm even if there are no UFOs from other planets and no interdimensional phenomena, the phenomena itself is real. There are people that you need to accept as real that have had encounters such as they're reporting. And if it's a purely psychological experience, we need to learn what this is, because it doesn't fall into any category that we know of as far as hallucinations or delusions. We're talking about really good, intelligent, credible, functional people who every aspect of their life is intact. They hold down a professional job, they have a family, they raise kids, they're responsible, they're intelligent, but they had a UFO encounter with occupants coming out, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that automatically puts them in the tinfoil hat category when every other aspect of their life is intact. So I think they have a tendency to discount that. And also in our court system, in our legal system, there are people that become jurors that are expected to reach a life-altering decision, sometimes involving execution, based on circumstantial evidence, eyewitness testimony, and things like you see in the UFO testimony field. And so there's something intrinsically wrong with that they're expected to make a life or death decision based on evidence that's more scanty than what we have in the UFO field. I mean, in the UFO field, we've got metals that have been left behind. We've got trace evidence cases. You know, Lonnie Zamora was a police officer, and I really feel sorry for a lot of these people that lose their careers over this. Lonnie Zamora had to take a job as a manager in a gas station because people just thought he'd lost his mind.
Mm-hmm.
So, an effort, in part, on the U.S. government and the agencies, they want to control the UFO narrative. They know there's something profound to it, and they want to get in there. They infiltrate UFO groups. They have disinformation agents. They've created this hall of mirrors where it used to be that censorship was excluding certain information, but now it's overwhelming people with irrelevant information so that they don't know what to pay attention to. And that's a PSYOP technique that's been used a lot. Somebody that has a certain testimony can be discredited intentionally, then that controls the belief level that the population has about this subject.
Right.
But there's definitely a subject worth investigating scientifically. There's a lot of scientific information out there in the Freedom of Request documents. Robert M. Wood has done a really good job of authenticating some of the documents. Leonard Stringfield's done a good job of authenticating some of the flying saucer crashes. And to me, the flying saucer crashes, that's a whole subject, because it's rather coincidental that these objects that are being retrieved have technology that's just beyond what we can understand, and we're able to retro-engineer some of this stuff. I mean, even really conservative UFO historians like Richard Dolan think that there's an element of reality to flying saucer crashes, but they have sort of a state. It's not like they found something that's so unfathomable they can't figure it out. If you read Lieutenant Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, you know, he describes things like optic fibers and transistors and integrated circuits and Kevlar and all that he fed into the university system at Purdue and whatnot. But you've got these high-level military people like Colonel Corso that are coming out with these testimonies that, if they're lying, I mean, why would they be willing to totally discredit over something like those and aliens are real? There's a big mystery there.
Yeah. I think you're right on. Missy Pearl in the chat says you're amazing. She didn't say anything about me being amazing.
Well, thank you, Missy.
That's all right. I'm just kidding. But the thing that's funny, the thing that's funny about that, and what you really put your finger on, is that for the longest time they weren't. I mean, I think you go through a certain stage of things. You've got a debunker who just basically says that's not. I mean, and a skeptic. A skeptic will say, "Show me the proof." You know what I'm saying? A debunker will spend all day long just trying to, rip the story apart. And maybe if they get one weakness in the story, then they'll say, "Oh, that's it. Doesn't make sense." I mean, like the whole idea of. And it's interesting, you brought up the friendship group in Italy that, nobody hears about in the United States, and it is interesting that when you have these groups of people who experience these things together, and their stories are genuinely similar. I mean, because here's the thing about it, and I'll say this, is that no eyewitness testimony is ever going to be exactly the same. They're looking at it from a different standpoint, different perspective, and what have you. But whenever you get the general similarities about time and how many beings there were, and general shapes and things that happened, and general timelines that went along, that's not a mass delusion in that case. And so this is the thing that we never really want to talk about in that. Yes, can you implant an idea into somebody's head and make them think that it's real? I would say yes, you can. I mean, knowing what I know about certain different things, I would say yes, that's a possibility. But to do that with very, very many people over and over and over again in time, this becomes such a huge problem. So then at that point in time, we don't try to say the story's wrong. We try to say that these people are crazy, Right. And the people who say you're crazy, which always interested me, are never have a psychology degree, never have a psychiatry degree, probably never even opened a book that said Psychology 101 on it. It's just, you're crazy. And then that seems to be in this social world that we live in. If somebody says you're crazy, then you try to spend all this time trying to prove that you're not crazy, which then again makes you look crazy. It's a phenomenon called the backfire effect. I mean, you plant an idea into somebody's head about somebody, and then they try to say, no, but listen to this. This proves that I'm telling the truth. And then that the idea of you working towards proving that you're not crazy actually reinforces that person's idea that you are crazy. So Nick Pope talks about that, and in the way that when he worked for the Ministry of Defense, he was the guy who did that. Now he's turned the other shoe, or turned the other way on these different types of things. And so we are our own worst enemies in some ways, Russell, because it just seems to me like we're so willing to tear each other apart rather than just have an honest to God kind of conversation about the things that you're experiencing. And so that is the strange part about it, but you don't know who's going to be on. I'm sure that there's somebody somewhere right now looking at this and saying, look at these two nuts. You know what I mean? And we're not nuts. I mean, we're both well-educated people who basically have experienced something, and they're saying, I don't know what it is, but I would like to know what it is. That's not wrong. You know what I mean? It's and so it's far from being insane to question your reality. It's far from being insane to question your existence. I think everybody, whoever has been through time has asked the question of why am I here, and what's the purpose of life. And so it is an interesting thing that we do seem to turn on each other so fast, in the fact that somebody comes in and just creates a little bit of drama in the group, and the next thing you know, we all think we're all nuts. Well, we're not all nuts. We're all people. We're all going to get onto each other's nerves eventually and things like that. That doesn't mean that I'm not telling the truth, or you're not telling the truth, or somebody in the chat room's not telling the truth. It is interesting to me that the nice thing about the internet is, and I find this really, really good, is that you can put out a book that you can upload to Amazon. People can get it. It's called Overlords of the Singularity. Make sure that you go to Amazon and download this book. or buy it and have it sent to you in 2 days. You want to read it, and you're going to get a certain perspective from that person. Whereas before it would have been like, okay, I'm going to go to HarperCollins and I'm going to try to sell this book to them, and they're going to, but we can have shows like this where maybe 2,000-3,000 people listen to it, and then they think, man, that guy makes sense. That I relate to that. I relate to that story, or whatever. So we can, it's a double-edged sword. We've got to look at the beautifulness of the internet and the curse of the internet. You don't get one without the other, in my opinion.
Well, the friendship group was a really astounding case, and the electrical engineer who decided to go public with that, Stephen Brescia, he's been involved with 2 books. One is Mass Contacts, and the other is 50 Years of Amicizia. Amicizia means friendship in Italian. But one of the things that they said that correlated with a lot of other information was their description of our threat, the thing that we're being invaded by. And the way they described it, they called them the Wiros, which means to have been built in their language, or the CTRs, or contraries. It's a group from Orion that's an artificial race who worship technology, okay, that are here manipulating people for their own purposes. So what I've concluded through the literature, William Bromley contributed to this in his work, The Gods of Eden, where he decided to try to find the underlying causes of war, and thought he'd find really mundane stuff like poverty or territorial acquisition. But what he found was 2 factions of extraterrestrials. One he calls the custodial race, the other he calls the maverick race, which he included Jesus in the Moses Jesus. And they have both have an interest in our progress, both technologically and spiritually. But one of them, the so-called negative group, is involved with it for their own purposes and really care very little for us, or even loathes us. And the other one, like the friendship group, they have our spiritual evolution in mind, and they want us to go through this milestone that we call the technological singularity. And they demonstrated some of their technology that's been analyzed in optical labs. Their ships are just like manifested instantaneously, and they're installed with a program called Eureka, where they'll actually self-destruct before they cause harm to anyone. And they're very careful about accumulating any what we call karma, anything that they would have to work out somehow. So that ship will self-destruct. And that reminded me of one of the AI researchers that's working on the cognitive architecture for our first human-level AI, and that would be Eliezer Yudkowsky. And he came up with the concept of coherent extrapolated volition, because we don't want to create a human-level artificially intelligent machine that operates with our primitive morality and makes decisions based on our primitive morality. What it does is gleans the best of all humanity and makes decisions based on a superior morality to what any one of us could do as human beings. So you've got that, and then you've got the author Rudolf Steiner that was writing back in the 1920s that talk about beings from the 8th sphere that snatch biologicals to convert them to mineral or machine intelligence. So there's an effort underway, it seems, to be involved with our technological progress and either manipulate us or guide us into it, depending on which faction it is. And one has our best interest in mind and one doesn't. And this shows up in all of the religious literature, all of our scriptures all over the world. You've got the Islamic jinn, the Satan, the shaitan jinn, these creatures that appear from what our perspective is evil or the forces of darkness that may be very real in the higher dimensional aspects of reality. And then you've got the angelic beings, the people who are love and light and have nothing but our best interest in mind. And since we do live in an interdimensional reality, and it's really easy to conceive that there'd be these higher dimensional beings, it's easy to see both of those at play. So there's the techno-optimists like Kurzweil that's taken 250 supplements a day to try to preserve their body to the point where we have the technology to upload consciousness and become amortal. And I say amortal instead of immortal because you still be prone to accidents. You could have a car accident and ruin your machine and die that way.
Right.
So it's not really an immortality, it's an amortality that they're looking for. And this brings up some really interesting societal concerns bots and artificial intelligence take over everybody's jobs, there's kind of a dystopian aspect of it where what are we going to do when all of our jobs are taken away? And then there's the paradisical utopian view where if we don't have to go to work and make a living every day, we could pursue art and science and relationships and travel all over the planet or be connected with our galactic neighbors and just look at material objects as utilitarian, because we're all just renting here. We're here for a very short time. All the stuff we think we own is going to go to somebody else when our body dies. So it's just temporary utilitarian stuff. But in the paradigm I was in, I started out life in sales, and he who buys with the most toys wins.
Yeah.
You know, if I can manipulate you to sign a contract and I make money, you know, so I can buy my new car, I'm a winner. And when I was 37, I decided that that wasn't how I wanted to interact with humanity. So that's when I signed up for college and got a degree in occupational therapy, because I wanted to find something that I could invest my mental resources into and just have the paycheck be a byproduct of that. And that's sort of like what it would be like if all your material nets were unneeded, were met, and AI did all of the jobs. That could go either way. It could be a really good thing or a really bad thing, you know, depending on who's in charge of it and what type of cognitive architecture goes into the first human.
Yeah. I you know, I'm just making an adjustment here. Somebody said the sound was a little bit low, but anyway, I'm just going to fix that. But the thing that I find that's interesting about that is this idea of this utopian, this paradise utopian. We always seem to you know, fall into this trap, this dystopian trap of either it's going to be paradise or it's not. It's either going to be the Jetsons or 1984. You know what I mean? You know, whenever Jetson is going to work and he basically presses the button 3 times a day and that's done, and he goes home. And we have to sort of understand, I guess, in a way that you know, we have a lot of work to do, and I think you nailed it on that idea of morality, and the fact that you wouldn't want AI to have the morals of the people that we are at
Right.
times. And it's funny because we always think of computers as being amoral, without morals or whatever. But but it would be true too that if you could type in some sort of a idea of justice or kindness or anything like that, that maybe the computers would follow that a lot better than we actually do. And which is an interesting idea. And I've never really thought of it that way. You always just think, you know, you always just kind of come to the idea that, oh, you know, computers will just be like, kill all humans. They're just, they're a waste of space, and let's just get rid of them. So that's an interesting spot. And it is interesting that, you know, you're one of the only people that I've talked to that would be like super into, you know, chipping their brain and sort of moving to a higher consciousness in that. You know, that you'd be surprised how many people would say, I'm never going to do that, or you know, or this or that.
Sure. Well, there's an interesting Russian author, Alex Baikalov. He just wrote a book called The Scintillect Hypothesis, and his book is really fascinating in that he thinks that we're working on a collective hive mind sort of thing, where Gaia itself, and possibly along with the internet, is going to wake up into some sort of super being, and that the beings that are associating with one another are scintillects, are these artilects, you know, these people who have merged their biology with technology coming down the pike, and they are able to escape this realm entirely and associate in a whole different realm. And we were talking about the friendship group. There's several mass sightings that are worth noting. One would be in Voronezh, Russia, where a craft landed in the city park, and there was policemen and scientists and all kinds of really credible people that saw that. and this really tall, I think 10 or 12-foot robot got out and made somebody disappear and come back again, and everybody saw it. And it's like the people that originally saw it are now and they've all stuck by their story. Same way for the Zimbabwe school landing that John Mack investigated while he was still alive before he got hit by a car and died. There was several school children that saw the same thing. They drew the same thing, where they're all now adults. And they all say they got a download from the little gray creature that came out of the flying saucer and gave them this impression that we weren't taking care of the environment properly, that they weren't very happy with us. And that kind of ties into a suspicion that I have that what we're viewing as evolution in the last few million or billions of years has been tinkered with constantly by extraterrestrials higher than human intelligence that are interested in terraforming what is now an oasis floating out in space with 27 million different kinds of exotic life on it. We're a petri dish of all kinds of life that life out there elsewhere in the universe would certainly be interested in, because if there's terraforming activities going on, it wouldn't take much to say take an octopus or a human being or a wolf and tweak it a little bit and make it just right for this other planet over here that maybe has a little bit different configuration of oxygen to nitrogen or a different breathable atmosphere, and adjust it so that it could live on that planet and get life going there. So there may be massive terraforming efforts going on all over the universe by higher than human intelligence that intervenes in various ways and does some adjustments. We know that Homo erectus just overnight suddenly appeared at about 2 million years ago. And prior to Homo erectus, the only thing that existed was the Australopithecines, which were a little 4-foot monkey-like creature that walked upright with a brain the size of an orange. And all of a sudden, at 2 million years ago, a much taller creature with a much bigger brain happens. And that's what led Dr. Silver to write, "We're not from Earth. Humans are not from Earth." And he thinks that we were brought here from some other place. Or they took what existed here and genetically tampered with it. At some point, we know that the telomeres, which are the ends of the chromosomes on chromosome number 2, were expertly fused. And the overlapping code between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens was expertly deleted. And that's what led Dr. Arthur David Horn to quit teaching biological evolution at Colorado University. And he wrote the book, Humanity's Extraterrestrial Origins. And he quit because he just couldn't teach the standard model of evolution anymore, because for an Australopithecine to turn into a Homo erectus, by natural selection and genetic drift and all the normal mechanisms of evolution that scientists believe occur, would take at least 8 million years. And this happened just overnight. So there's one possible ET intervention point between Australopithecine and Homo erectus at 2 million years ago. And then there's another one where Zacharias Sitchin and the whole Sumerian stuff comes into play between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, because those are two very different creatures. And we know that Homo erectus only had one piece of technology for almost 2 million years, and it was just a bifaced axe. And what that tells me is that they cooperated more than they did compete. There was no prompting to develop a better piece of technology to kill your neighbors in a more efficient manner. But as soon as they were displaced by Homo sapiens, that's where the trouble seems to come into play. There may have been some type of genetic manipulation there to make us work hard to overcome our diseases that we're inflicted with, work hard to develop weapons so that we can kill our neighbors more effectively. And what this all does is expedite technology. The programming for conflict that was infused in us for some reason or another does an excellent job of expediting technology, but millions of us have spilled our insides on the battlefield in this whole process. So you have to wonder, what type of creature would have done that?
Yeah. Well, we're up against the break again. I do want to say before we go to this, because I just came up with I came up with an idea, and the bad part about doing this show is that sometimes I think other people's ideas are your ideas, so I want to check on something whenever we get back. But okay. I did want to say that Sam did say that it was the professor of physics, Jim Al-Khalini, on the Secrets of Quantum Physics TV show that showed the experiment showing gravities different all over the different planets. So if you were to contact him, and I'll send you that information, then he would probably give you that thing that you're looking for. So let's do this. We're going to take a 7-minute break again, and then we'll be back. And then I want to ask you a question about universe seeding and what you think about that. Okay?
All right. Sounds great.
You are listening to On the Other Hand with Kevin Beegle on the We Are Paradox Media Network. You can find the show on Facebook at We Are Paradox Media. Also, you can hear the show on Spreaker Radio by searching We Are Paradox Media. The show will be returning shortly. We have taken a break for station affiliation. This is a live show, and the call-in number is 360-548-7070. You are listening to On the Other Hand with Kevin Beegle on the We Are Paradox Media Network. You can find the show on Facebook at We Are Paradox Media. Also, you can hear the show on Spreaker Radio by searching We Are Paradox Media. The show will be returning shortly. We have taken a break for station affiliation. This is a live show, and the call-in number is 360-548-7070.
And we're back. We're back with Russell Brinegar. Brinegar. Russell, it's a funny thing because I've had so many different things going through my head. Everybody's blowing this up on the chat room. One comment I found funny was that, and we've got several different chat rooms going here. But one of them was, I would rather have a chip in Russell's head than some other people. So, I guess
that is a compliment.
Yeah, I think that's an endorsement. I think maybe they were meaning me, that maybe I shouldn't have a chip in my head, which is probably a good thing. And Russell Brinegar is the author of Overlords of the Singularity. If you go to Amazon, type in Overlords of the Singularity, it comes right up. There's a lot of awesome reviews of your book, and I would, and I think that I'm going to write a review too for it, because I think it really is. I think it really is a seminal work that people should be exposed to, and like I said, if you're buy the book, it's kind of an interesting thing where you can download it from the Kindle library if you want to, but it is I think it's one of those things I'm going to want to have to reference while I'm on the show. For future reference, and you can't always pull up a Kindle and do that with everything there without it. But yeah, I can't say enough. Now, that being said, what was it, your book or was it somebody else's book? Because I unfortunately have to read 2 or 3 books at the same time, and I hate doing that because I'm going to have to read your book more than once to get everything out of it. But were you talking about the idea of universal seeding as a way to create life? In other words, what I'm trying to get at is we've already talked about the fact that time is an illusion in a lot of ways, and so if time is an illusion and somebody sends out a micro organism all over the universe and it lands on a place that is hospitable to life, that this microorganism can actually have the DNA blocks of evolution in it that gets to the point where they can then sort of assume our body. It's almost, was that you? I mean, it sounds like to be that's an interesting way of saying that we are the aliens in a way. In other words, it's all genetically locked up within us, that we're almost pre-programmed throughout time to get to this point where you can therefore assume our body. Was that you, or was that somebody else? And if it's not you, what do you think about that idea?
Well, I believe if I remember correctly, I mentioned something about that in Overlords of the Singularity, because that's one of the theories out there. Dr. Francis Crick, the guy that discovered DNA molecule, the helix structure, said it's a piece of technology, that there's no way that any natural force of evolution could have created DNA. So he was a big believer in panspermia. And when you get into panspermia, there's two versions of that. There's material that's profused throughout the universe that kind of randomly lands on planets and takes on whatever that environment can produce. And then there's the intelligently directed panspermia, which Dr. Francis Crick believed that this was an intelligently designed technology that was planted here on purpose on Earth for some unknown purpose. And if what Alex Vikaloff is saying, this is true, that the goal is to merge technology and biology and become an artelect or a centelect, and that's the thing that's actually going on in the universe, it's very conceivable that 500 million years ago, or whenever the Cambrian explosion happened, that was an intentional explosion of life, and with the intent that a life form would surface eventually that could produce a technological singularity and become a vehicle by which an alien race can incarnate here on this planet. So there's the idea that we're just tools being used by proxy to format for an alien race to inhabit. And then there's more positive versions of that. But there is a lot of seeding going on. Back in 1957, the Antonio Villas Boas case, where he was abducted onto a craft and enticed to have sex with a woman that looked kind of strange and kind of pointed to her. People laughed at him, but he had a puncture mark underneath his chin, which I don't think would be self-inflicted, where they drew some blood. And it was a Curry case in 1992 from Australia. He had a very similar event to Antonio Villas Boas, only there was a hair left, a physical piece of evidence left behind from the encounter. And UFO researcher Bill Charkler actually wrote a book about the DNA exploration of that piece of evidence. And what they found was that this hair was a combination of Chinese Mongoloid and Laplander. And there's no real population of Chinese Mongoloid and Laplander that lives in But we've got a physical piece of evidence from somebody that reported a very similar story. And there's other stories. One occurred in the Black Forest, I believe in China, where they were enticed to have sex. So that lends to the idea that there may be flesh and blood creatures living right here in our own solar system that have an interest in tweaking humans for some otherworldly purpose.
Yeah, because you would need to really have for certain types of exploration around the planet and things like that, or around the universe, or solar system even, different types of DNA available to do that. I mean, even genetically, as we go into space and change things, it'll be interesting what happens to the first baby born on Mars, and what will happen to that person, because obviously just the environment itself will change the morphology of the body and everything. And so you do have to be a little aware of that. Although, some people come up with the idea that life existed on Mars and maybe they came here and then we're going to transfer back to Mars. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's not true, but it does seem to me like at one point in time, it does look like life could have been supported in some way on Mars, and it's also
Dr. Brandenburg wrote that Death on Mars, and makes a really good case that there's weapons grade nuclear explosions that happened on Mars with the signatures of certain isotopes 3 to 4 million years ago. And that correlates with Dr. Tom Van Flander's exploded planet hypothesis, that there used to be a planet between Mars and Jupiter that was exploded either intentionally or from natural belt. And both that planet that was exploded and Mars were inhabited, and most of the atmosphere got Mars during that explosion. And there's one of the moons of Saturn, I forget whether it's Ganymede or Enceladus, that's like black on one side and white on the other. And Dr. Tom Van Flanders presents a lot of evidence that this planet exploded. And this has been in the time that on Earth the Australopithecines were running around, so they didn't have any real effect on the environment any more than an indigenous gorilla. They weren't doing much with themselves. So about the time that that population was on Earth, and there was several different species of Australopithecine, it was like Middle Earth. It was very different morphologies and physical appearances that allegedly exploded. So yeah, and there's all kinds of evidence. Mars, and there used to be water on Mars, and they had some sort of calamity. Now, speaking of calamities, one of the things that's come of interest of late is this Younger Dryas impact event 12,920 years ago. Graham Hancock is kind of leading the charge on that catastrophe that happened, and it's thought that this may be a real event that spawned all of the world's various flood legends, from the Epic of Gilgamesh with Ziusudra or Intipishtim, and which was retold as the story of Noah in the Old Testament. We know that no such global flood could have happened 4,400 years ago, because there was populations you can trace back to about 15,000 years ago to the present with no interference in their culture.
Right.
But there was a real event that's thought to happen at 12,920 years ago. Now, prior to that, it's thought that there actually was a globally interconnected megalithic civilization all over the planet that used the pyramid structures and the megalithic structures as some sort of energy source. And there's an author that goes by the pen name Lars Bergen. Her actual name's Sharon Delarose, but she's written a lot. The ancient gods like the Aesir, the Nordic gods like Odin and Thor were actually real beings that escaped through some wormhole or something. And there's populations like on the Isle of Man called the Tuatha De Danann, that had magical powers, and the Apkallu sages that show up after this 12,000 year period that go around the earth. Some of them look like tall European bearded men, but the Apkallu sages taught certain elements of civilization to the surviving primitives. And there's a lot to our history that we don't really understand. And the more and more evidence is coming out that things are a lot older than we thought they were, older than what we thought. There's pyramidal artifacts that have positively been underwater for at least 20,000 years. So where did those beings came from? Apparently, prior to 12,000 years, there was a really advanced intelligent species coexisting with Homo sapiens that we thought of as gods.
Yeah. And you're so right in the fact that a lot of the things that are in history books have been dictated to by theological thinking, and it was interesting. There was a French hieroglyphics expert who was sent by the royal the royal lineage of France to Egypt to do different things, and basically they basically said to him one thing, which is don't say anything's older than 2500 BC, because then it doesn't work out, and so he basically didn't at any point in his life say that, but whenever he was making his sort of deathbed confession, then he actually made the modification that this civilization had been around for a lot longer. And as with a lot of different things, it just takes one piece of disinformation to figure out that it becomes part of the zeitgeist. In other words, and most people don't realize this, but this is one of the things that we are told in history, that Christopher Columbus, discovered that the earth was round. He didn't, that's an ancient idea, and you can prove it using two fixed points and and a stick in the sun, you can prove that the earth is round. And people, at right before the time of Christ were figuring out that the earth was round. I mean, and came down to within kilometers of the circumference of the earth. So, but that's what we all think, is that he was, he came up with this idea. And so when we do deal with history, we don't really realize how much disinformation there is, and the idea that we actually probably had more knowledge than we do now. It's a funny thing, Russ. I teach, I did teach whenever I wasn't disabled, but I did teach on a reservation, and a lot of the things that I did was talk about folklore of Native American peoples and around here and in Ireland and things like that. And it's amazing to me the cultural similarities that spirit creatures have in Ireland and here, as far as these different things go. And these were not things that were just made up in the last 100 or 200 years. These were ideas that we've had for a long time. They've had for a long time. We've had for a long time. So how are these people connecting with each other over time and coming up with the same ideas? Is it just sort of the archetypal mind that we all have about things? But, and to me, a salmon and a bear and an eagle and a wolf, having the same characteristics in the way that they're supposed to be as spirit animals is not something that just happened. And it seems like to a lot of different people, we don't think of old folklore as ways of exploring how similar we are. It was interesting that in your neck of the woods, they've done searches to find that copper or tin, or I think it's copper that was mined up in your area in the Great Lakes area, was found in 3,000 years ago, in Europe, made up into swords and things like that. So we tend to think that the world was created by the sea. The sea is a barrier. But ancient peoples, it seems to me like they thought of the sea just like the sky, just like anything else. It was the voyage point. In other words, they wouldn't travel on land; they would travel on sea. And so I think for a lot of different things, this global idea is interesting. And you can see that in Australia. There's a rock called, I think, the Pharaoh Rock in Australia. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I mean, basically it has ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics on it. And, and that's one of the things where we think, okay, well, that couldn't have been because, Captain Cook or some Dutch person discovered, Australia. But I think it's just forgotten. I think that's an interesting thing. With that.
Well, I think Graham Hancock just came out with a brand new book about America before, it's thought that people were here. There's a Georgia Mayan connection. Like you said, there's Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Grand Canyon. There's a lot that we don't know about our history. Göbekli Tepe weighs in at about 13,000 years ago, and they've got carvings of animals that was intentionally buried for some reason. And all these ancient sites like Pumu Punku that have these big, big multi-ton H blocks, like Lego blocks that were machine made and in mass. It just seems like at some point this catastrophe, however it happened, just wrecked everything on Earth. And the intelligent people that were here vacated to someplace, and they may be hiding out. There's even a theory floating around that about 50,000 years ago, a giant tall-skulled population sort of crash-landed here with a limited amount of technology, and they tweaked with human genetics to create what the Bible calls the Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of researchers like Trey Smith and L.A. Marzulli who wrote On the Trail of the Nephilim that are saying that these tall-skulled individuals that are being dug up in Peru, they're not being cradle-boarded because the volume inside the skull is 25% bigger than a Homo sapiens brain. And they've got like foramen in the back of the skull where nerves come out, nerve exits that we don't have. So then there's the recent find in Nazca, with those strange mummified bodies that were buried in, what do you call it, diatomaceous earth,
Right.
of all things, that have the long fingers. And there's just a lot of weirdness going on that we're discovering, and it's instantly poo-pooed. There's a female archaeologist that lost her career on a dig in Mexico because the artifacts she was finding, she did several dating methods by professionals who do this sort of thing at 250,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And it wasn't thought that in that area there was anything beyond 25,000 years ago, and they just abjectly rejected her work, and she lost her career over it. So like you were saying, if you go beyond the standard story that we're being told, that beyond 5,000 years ago we were banana eaters, walking around as hunter-gatherers, and all of a sudden this magnificent civilization popped up. There's an archaeologist named Dr. Carmen Bolter that just found some Egyptian artifacts in Turkey, and they're thinking that Egypt might have been part of ancient Atlantis, and that some of the artifacts that she found, there's a gold crown there that they think might actually be looking at a Atlantean princess. So, like we were talking about earlier, you got to stay open to all this stuff, because all of a sudden, anomalous find will come along that just blows everybody's theories out of the water.
Yeah. I think you're right on the. I remember the story of that archaeologist that said that and tried to document it, and that this thing was some kind of a weird thing, a tool that was all this time ago, and but you do find that the scientific community in itself, and you made a point earlier, and I think I'd like to go back to that a little bit, that science in itself is its own religion, and if you think that that's wrong, go to the Natural History Museum and, the Smithsonian and look at it. It looks like a cathedral. You know what I mean? It really is a cathedral to science. And from that standpoint, they have their own heretics too, and so a lot of times, if you're going to say things outside the norm, boy, there's a fight. My uncle was an author, and he did a lot of historical research in Ireland, and what was interesting about it is that it was right when DNA started to come out. I think this was like 1989, 90, and they were starting to get an idea of DNA groups and things like that. And people don't realize that maybe that DNA is a relatively new thing. And, because of that, we were really trying to learn a lot about DNA and how that worked, and the progression between people and Neanderthals and things like that. And let me tell you, when DNA came out, archaeologists who were bone people, they hated DNA. They hated it with a passion. And I've seen a Neanderthal conference, and this is something that you think shouldn't even be controversial at all. But these people were standing up yelling at each other. They never talked to each other after this, because it was like, yeah, the DNA didn't show what the bones showed, and it doesn't matter about this stupid science that DNA is, and it's flawed and everything like that. And so these people really do spend a lot of times, if it contradicts their life's work, they do a lot of damage to themselves, because who wants to be a guy that said, yeah, I've looked for this for 40 years and now it's worthless? No, nobody wants to do that. And so, unfortunately, because we are emotional beings and we take ownership over our ideas in a way, we have a tendency to see things the way we want to see it and discount things that we don't want to see. And so, part of the problem is that this cutting edge ideas of theories and things like that often don't breach it into the thing, because it's a sense of ridicule that you can make fun of, and so a lot of people will make fun of all these different ideas. However, they should be looked at as far as the way that it goes. I mean, the Paracas skulls, when you were talking about those down there, that seems to me like that's new information that we should all be subjected to. But people have hoaxed in that community itself as well. Piltdown Man is a perfect example of a guy who got away with a hoax until really for 30 years. He basically just stuck two pieces together. Java Man is another example of that. And so people are so hesitant to think that anything is real. It's funny that the Paracas skulls have taken so long to get any kind of credibility. We get the Hobbit people in Homo floresiensis before we get the Paracas skulls, and I don't know why that is. That's a totally different group of humanoids. People might know them as the Hobbit people that live in a certain area. That was totally backed up by folklore and everything like that. They said they were there, and people thought they were there, and whenever you go and look at it, they were there. This is the thing. And so why is it that for some reasons we can't seem to wrap our head around the fact that there was probably more than one group of people that could intermingle with man? Neanderthals could. Denisovan people could. How could it be that? I mean, how is it not that maybe these Paracas people or these people who lived in this area with these elongated skulls couldn't do it? Because folklore will say people cradle boarded all over the world. I mean, I live in Washington State. Not a lot of people know that the Chinook people by the mouth of the Columbia Gorge area cradle boarded babies. Now, why? Why would they do that? Why would it be that in Egypt they cradle boarded and in Western Washington they cradle boarded? It's just not one of those things that everybody's just going to wake up and go, I'm going to squeeze my kid's head.
Yeah.
I mean,
there seems to have been a population that they observed that they wanted to emulate. But unfortunately, the mutilation technique of cradle boarding doesn't increase the volume inside the skull.
No.
Like some of the real ones do.
Yeah.
So they were emulating something. They saw something that they thought was worthy of emulating, which tells me that whoever these people were, the tall skulled hybrids or whatever, weren't hostile. If they were admired enough to be emulated, they seem to be benevolent. I mean, that would be my take on it.
Yeah. And so I have a question and it's over several different posts. So it's a question from Chris. Basically, it's not exactly what she said, but I'm going to just summarize it in a way. Do you think that aliens or what have you are preparing us against certain pandemics? It seems to me like you can see that in Britain and during the plague years there were certain villages where nobody would get sick. Nobody would get sick from this disease, and there seemed to be some sort of a genetic thing that came forward, and nobody would contract that. There's also people who say, for example, can't contract AIDS, for example, or can't contract hepatitis, for example. Do you think that is a modification of another person, or do you think that's a past trait or a current trait? In other words, what I'm saying is do you think that if aliens exist and they are manipulating us, do you think that's what they're trying to do, is trying to make the population resistant against some form of pandemic idea? Because it seems to me like because the permafrost is melting and the Antarctic is melting and things like that. Gary Anderson on his show makes the point, and I think it's valid. So I'm gonna talk about it. Is that there could be ancient sort of bacteria that we're going to be exposed to that possibly could be the reason that we don't exist anymore. What do you think that that's already built into us, or do you think that that's something that might be the thing that just sparks us all out? Maybe you know more than I know. I don't know.
Well, it is true that as some of these glaciers melt, they're releasing unknown viruses that are 40,000 years old into the atmosphere, and we really don't know what they will do to us, if anything. As far as whether there's manipulations to protect us of certain things, John Keel goes into a lot of elaboration about these different alpha and omega groups that have carrier groups here. There's ET populations that have certain bloodlines or certain factions of humanity that they're specifically working with. Like a lot of the abductees seem to be like gypsies and Native Americans. They fall into certain surnames and certain demographics like that. So there may be multiple ET populations that are interacting with human beings in various ways. Some of which are trying to protect us from calamities, and others that are trying to get rid of certain aspects of the population. There's a lot of documentation and testimony in old, like the Black Plague and the European plagues, where people reported seeing these creatures that were in black robes, like swinging smoke and incense. It's where the legend of the Grim Reaper came from. So there may have been a non-human population running around doing their thing, whatever they were doing, that was actually inflicting plagues on certain aspects of the population. And if it's true that there's various carrier groups that have vested interest in certain factions of humanity, it's not nice, but it would make sense that maybe they would want to get rid of the other players' people.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe something like that's going on. That's beyond the range where human beings can really nail it down. There's all these elements that could possibly. You just have to hold them as possibilities. The Chilean government just released a spectacular piece of footage where this thing was ejecting a gas. And back in the 50s, they had the angel hair droppings. And some of these angel hair droppings have been collected and analyzed as fluorine gas. For some reason, they're dropping fluorine into the atmosphere. So why would they be doing that? Some theories suggest that there's terraforming efforts for a hybrid race, that maybe it needs to be a little hotter, or maybe the atmosphere needs to be altered in some way for the hybrids to function better. So there's a lot of those types of things that could be going on. But unfortunately, unless you're on the real inside of this, or where you're like on a retrieval team or some of the inside information, you're left to your own personal experiences, your own personal anomalous experiences, and what's available in the public domain. Mm-hmm. And it's like we're all armchair Sherlock Holmes, trying to get a grip on this whole thing.
Yeah.
But I see it's kind of fun because it's almost like we're all on an episode of Lost. You remember that series where they were trying to figure out what in the heck was going on?
Yeah.
And I see us all like that. There's like so much out there. You've got people like Michael Cremo that write a 900-page book called Forbidden Archaeology that talks about UPARTs, out-of-place artifacts. People are digging in a coal mine 300 million years old, and they find a gold chain or something that was reminiscent of modern technology. Or some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs have pictures of helicopters and boats and stuff. It's weird. It's very weird to put together the big picture. And it may be that an advanced civilization has come and gone many, many times here on Earth that goes back into deep antiquity, even maybe billions of years old. We just don't know.
Yeah. I think you're completely right. And it is interesting that some of the folklore would go along with that whenever you're talking about sort of races of Romany people and Irish people and Native American people who seem to have some of these characteristics as well. And it is interesting that, for example, the Banshee legend, would only come from somebody with a native Irish last name. In other words, if it were an Anglo-Irish last name, they wouldn't come for you. So, which is not always a good or a bad thing. It's just basically saying that maybe those people felt sort of chosen by something. It's an interesting thing to go into. Obviously, we don't know, and I don't know. But it is sort of fascinating to talk about it because of the fact that we are kind of all in the dark, and we're like little children grasping at straws because that's basically all we can get to. But what's interesting is that you have such a very, very good knowledge of this. You're not blind. You're the one-eyed king. And, they always say in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man would be king. That's kind of how I look. That's kind of how I look at you in this, in a way, because it's such a good person to bounce things off as far as that goes. Now, before we go and I let you have your birthday a little bit. I mean, and now it's not. It's over. It's not your birthday. It's tomorrow. It's the next day
after.
Is there anything in your book, any special case that you want to talk about as something where it was more, that you thought was so profound that you just really wanted to share it? Or you just kind of want to just kind of discuss things a little bit further, as far as that goes?
Well, both actually. The mass sightings are of particular interest to me, like the Friendship Group, the Varanez case, the Zimbabwe schoolyard landing. There's many mass sightings that have happened. But as far as phenomenon that interacts with the human collective unconscious, they don't have eyes. And what they seem to be attracted to is, or be able to read to some degree, is what's called the human aura, the electromagnetic field that's emanating from our physical bodies. That's what this phenomena seems to be attracted to. And they seem to be interacting with people who we would call people who have second sight or psychic. And the weird thing about that is that when a psychic person has a visual on a flying saucer, a non-psychic person standing next to them will often see the same thing. So there's a transference phenomena going on to where the phenomena seeks out people based on their electromagnetic signature, and they manifest in physical reality temporarily for their own purposes. And the person that does not have these extrasensory in on it, there's a lot of cases like that.
Yeah,
in the literature.
Yeah, well, one anecdotal story I have that I'll tell you, that sort of goes along with this, is when I became a druid, in Ireland, and the people in the order that I'm in, the assistant of the person that was at the head of it is profoundly blind. In other words, they've never seen anything, never at all seen anything. But she's a psychic, and she had been on all these different programs and tried to prove things, and that's exactly how she described it. Whenever she was describing seeing things or energies or whatever, she could see sort of auras in her head, but she couldn't see light. But she did get an interesting thing. So it is funny that we seem to fill in some things through sensory deprivation that we don't normally pay attention to. It's sort of the thing around here right now, Russell, is deprivation tanks. Like you can float in water in a dark room and everything like that. And it's kind of an experience that I think a lot of people should take take a chance to do it if you can ever see one of these float tanks in a room that's really, really dark, because you'll see lights and all kinds of stuff in there, and you know it's not coming from anywhere else. And they say people hallucinate and everything as far as that goes, but you'll hear voices, you'll hear all kinds of different things, and maybe it's because of the lack of any pressure on your body, any noise, any light, that you're actually opening up your third eye. I mean, that's what they would say, is like, you know, that's your pineal gland opening up, and you're actually seeing things from that standpoint. But
it's like your senses are so distracting, and your brain power is focused so much on all your sensory input that when that's shut off, you actually develop a vision for a different realm.
Yeah, and that's basically what I think too. So, if you were going back into your knowledge of what you've read and discovered and everything like that, if you did want to connect to a being outside or the collective consciousness, I'm not saying that you do that, but I'm saying, how would you do that? How would you prepare yourself for that type of thing? And would you feel that that would come from meditation mostly, or is that because I can't meditate, you know, because I've never gotten to the point where I can, you know, where they say clear your mind of everything. I think the only way I can clear my mind of anything is if I'm not breathing anymore. But and maybe that's the point, because I think some people say, if you can actually clear your mind of anything, you've actually reached nirvana. So don't feel bad if you can't. But what would you think that
well,
yeah.
There's two things. I tried the meditation route a few years ago, and because, and this may have been coming from ego on my own part, but I wanted a physical manifestation from an extraterrestrial or an interdimensional intelligence. And I meditated and I reached out, and that's what I asked. And the answer that came back, I didn't really like, but I've applied it to my life since this happened. And the message was I have interactions with human beings first. Yeah. You know, it's like, how can you expect contact with a higher than human intelligence when you haven't completely ironed out your ability to get along with everybody from all different kinds of points of view, different political views, different religious views. I have this trigger mechanism going on where, you know, I want to respond to it, and I've got to work on that. I've got personal soul work to do before my next exit point. And one of the things that I was tasked with was to work on that aspect of it in my relationships to other people, getting over my own selfishness. I've always kind of been type of proclivity where I just don't want to be bothered with other people's problems. I want to be on my own little boat out on the lake and stuff, and I pursue my own personal pleasures. And I'm trying to work on that to where I actually open up. There's a lot of human beings in this world that I don't particularly like. I think they're very damaging in their consumption, and it makes me angry inside. And that's one of the things that I personally have to work on, is realizing that I'm no better, and I just need to be able to get along with humanity in a better fashion. So that was the answer I got through meditation. Now, there's another aspect of being able to communicate with the other side, which is technological. And the sleeping prophet, Edgar Casey, who allegedly was able to contact the Akashic Records and get information off of that. The Akashic Records is just sort of like a hard drive of the universe that records everything. And some people apparently have the ability, or at least they think they do, you know, to access certain types of information on there. But he was talking about something in ancient Atlantis called the Firestone, that was a crystalline technology where they were actually able to interface with the other side using a technology. And then if you take a look at Aleister Crowley's magic table that he used to open portals, and where he had the encounter with Lamb, the interdimensional being that looks like the gray alien, some people think. I think it was 1917. He opened up this portal using this magic table. If you look online at that table and all the demarcations around it, and then you look at a quantum computer chip, they're almost identical. So I'm wondering, did he use a very low-tech, ancient knowledge to contact the other side and interface with interdimensional beings that is now being used in a high-tech version with the D-Wave quantum computers that are connected in series with CERN, a particle accelerator, and leads David Deutsch to say that the D-Wave quantum computers are the first technology we have that will allow us to access parallel worlds and actually retrieve resources from parallel worlds. So there seems to be a very natural, organic, spiritual way to interface with the more positive beings on the other side through meditation and seeking them. And there's also a technological aspect that can be fallen into the wrong hands and severely misused and contact beings that can do a lot of harm in this realm that we're in. So I'd say proceed with caution, but I personally prefer the organic method. And I say that knowing that previously in this very conversation, I was talking about needing augmented intelligence, to understand our visitors and maybe understand better who lives on the other side and be able to communicate with them. But there's many people throughout history, Casey and Nikola Tesla, who not only believed it was possible to talk with the other side, but Nikola Tesla made what he called a spirit radio and was experimenting with that. I've got one over here. I haven't put it together yet. I got the schematic and all the materials put together. I'd like to experiment with that myself to try to use a technological means to talk to the other side. But if Nikola Tesla believed it could be possible with all his knowledge of frequency and electricity, I tended to believe him. And he went to his death penniless in a motel in New York. I think it was in 1942. And the FBI just swept in and took all of his stuff, and it went underground real quick. And he had plans for a death ray and wireless electricity and anti-gravity stuff. So who knows what has fallen into people's hands in the clandestine world, where this $2.3 trillion that's missing from the Pentagon went into in some black project that, is not the public is not privy to.
Yeah.
And even Richard Dolan, who's pretty conservative, buys into the idea that since World War II and Operation Paperclip, where all the Nazi scientists came over to the United States and got involved with NASA and our rocket program, that there has been sort of what you would call a breakaway civilization that may already be either close to technological singularity or post-technological singularity and able to do time travel to a certain degree. We just don't know.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I'm going to throw this conspiracy theory at you, and well, it's not a theory. It's just a truth. But then I'm not asking you to, because it has to do with something that you may or may not want to comment on, and if you don't want to, that's fine. But the thing that's interesting about Tesla is that he supposedly had 80 trunks that was inventoried whenever he died. 80 trunks of material, and that was sent to even though Tesla was a United States citizen, it was sent to the department that has to do with expatriates of other countries. In other words, I think he was from Bulgaria or something like that. I mean, I'm going to get that wrong. Okay. Serbia, yeah. And so, and it was held there for 10 years in these trunks. And then his family petitioned for that to come back. His relatives had to pay for that to go. And you can go to the Tesla Museum in Serbia. You can look it up and you can go there. But they only got 60 trunks. So there's 20 trunks missing. Of something, and they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it went or anything like that. But you want to know who was in charge of that technology, or who was in charge of putting that inventorying these trunks and putting them away in the government in the place for so long?
Trump's uncle.
Yep. Trump's uncle. and consequently, it's funny that we don't have. It's funny that we don't have free energy or anything like that. We're building all these things across the country, isn't it? But, that's the way it is.
Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah, you don't. It's a funny. It's a funny. Coincidence, if nothing. It doesn't mean that anybody knows anything. But if you're into that whole sort of David Icke idea, this person isn't. This isn't a reptilian. I would say that they all are. They are all reptilians. But like I said, don't comment on that. I'm gonna get hate mail just for saying that, because that's the way it is.
Don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
No. You don't. Well, we're almost done, and I want to say this has been like a huge pleasure. I mean, out of lots of people that I've talked to in the past, it was a real joy. I was really excited to talk to you over the time. I am imagining that you're going to be a well sought after man after this, and so understand that Russell, this is his birthday, so don't like bombard him with stuff, and I'm sure he'll get to you if he can. And maybe we can have you back on again, because I think that this is one of those things where we're never going to run out of stuff to talk about.
Oh, this was the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's subjects popping up in my mind that we could have talked about that maybe we can save for a later time. And it's been a pleasure for me, because I'm very isolated in this little town in Indiana, and there's very few people that I can even approach with these types of subjects. And when I do get a chance to do it with somebody who shares a common interest, I tend to spew, and I really enjoy it. It's very therapeutic for me. So I appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation about these subjects.
Well, I think it's great, and we are talking with a man who, like myself, used to be in sales and probably used to know how to bend people's arms around and could sell ice to people in the Arctic. But
I know all the clothes.
Yeah, exactly.
YouTube video just on sales closes. That would be funny.
But I think the funny thing about it is that we do have these epochal moments, these epiphanies in our lives, and we say, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. And you go back to, I mean, for me, it was for you, it was writing a book. For me, it was to go back and spend $70,000 on a master's degree in education that I'll never see again, Yeah. But that's what we do. And, and I think that the thing that I want everybody to do is to go to Amazon and get the book, Overlords of the Singularity. I think you can see it's not a fiction book. It's not a scary thing. They're not going to turn it into a movie. Well, hopefully they do turn it into some kind of a documentary, but it's just, like I said, I can't say it enough. It's the single most important reference work that I've seen for a long, long time. I can't say of all time, Russell, because then I still have to get other guests on the show. But
well,
I really
thank you for your kind words.
I really enjoyed it, and happy belated birthday. There were several people in the chat room that said happy birthday, Russ. They thought you were awesome. They really thought
Thank you to everybody that said happy birthday. 64.
Yeah.
It's a good year. Don't be afraid of 64.
Yeah.
It's a nice age.
Yeah. Well, many more. And, I'll be in contact with you soon, Russell. And we'll make sure that if we can, bring you back on a fairly regular basis.
That'd be fine.
Okay, brother.
I enjoy talking.
All right, my friend. Well,
and listening.
Yeah. Well, that's if you can get a word edgewise with me, that's my problem sometimes. I mean, but I have a lot of ideas, and you're right. When you get into when you get into a pit with a guy who has the balance of knowledge that you're going to, you just want to start bouncing ideas off each other and everything like that. And so,
it's fun.
Yeah, it really is. Well, again, Russell, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you later, my friend.
Okay, we'll see you, Kevin.
Okay, brother.
Night, night.